Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Change, 3 tools for moving from response to resilience. My name is Duncan Fields, and I'm a community animator with the Tamarack Institute. Before we begin, we just wanted to take a moment by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous lands. And as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. And as settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of the truth and reconciliation real within our communities. And today I'm joining from Mississauga, Ontario, which is the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we invite you to share what land you're joining from in the chat box as we get going. It's my pleasure to introduce our discussion today on the practice of navigating change. And I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today, Liz Weaver and Sylvia Cheuy. So Liz is the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, where she's leading the Tamarack Learning Center. She's passionate about the power and potential of communities getting to impact on complex issues. And prior to her current role at Tamarack, Liz led the Vibrant Communities Canada team and assisted place-based collaborative tables develop their frameworks of change and supported and guided their projects from idea to impact. So welcome, Liz. As well, Sylvia is a consulting director of the Tamarack Institute's Collective Impact Idea Area. She's very passionate about community change and what becomes possible when residents and various sector leaders share an aspirational vision for their future. She believes that when the assets of residents and community are identified and connected, they become powerful drivers of community change. So welcome, Liz and Sylvia, to today's call.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thanks so much, Duncan.
Yeah, just before we get going, we also wanted to offer you a brief snapshot of who's joining us today and the various perspectives that they represent. So we have a pretty diverse crowd with us today on the call. We had 450 learners register for today's webinar from countries such as Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Mexico, Germany, Poland, South Africa, Turkey, Afghanistan, Nepal, Israel, Mexico, and the Philippines. And we invite you, if we missed your country, just to let us know in the chat box as well. And quite a few different sectors represented as well, including health, government, nonprofit, post-secondary, foundations, Indigenous organizations, arts, and sustainability. So welcome, everyone. We're really glad that you're joining us today. Just as we get started, Sylvia, we wanted to start with this poll, just getting a temperature check on who's in the room. Do you want to explain this one just a bit?
Happy to. Thanks, Duncan. So what we'd love to do, we're about to start a poll, but I invite you to take a minute, kind of take a look at the 6 images there on your screen. And in the poll, you will be asked to choose the picture that you think best represents how you're feeling right now.
So here are the results from today's poll. So as I suspected, image 1 was the favorite, but it was a close call. Lots of people resonating with number 6 of the water droplet and the ripples, and number 4, which I suspect is taking a leap of faith. Any thoughts on that, Sylvia?
I think what I love most about this is the opportunity to just stand still for a moment, catch your breath, and check in with yourself in terms of where you're at. And I also love, it's a quick and easy way for us to get a sense that given all the change that's in front of us right now, it's not unusual that there's a diversity of responses that show up in the face of the same conditions. And I think that's another really important piece to ground in as we explore tools for navigating change. So I'd love to throw it over to you, Liz, to kick us off and frame out how we think about this.
Thanks so much, Sylvia, and hi, everybody. Happy to be joining you on the call. When we were thinking about navigating change, we started to look at some resources, and we came across this one by Jim Clemmer, who's with the Clemmer Group, and he talks about the context of navigating change. And he actually talked from forces beyond our control, the list from there and further, and I added in significant and frequent disruptions, because if I look around, what we've had to incur in Canada and other places, there has been this kind of significant disruption that we're all in right now in terms of COVID-19, but there have been also for some communities frequent disruptions that occur. If you think about the folks in Wood Buffalo, Alberta, you know, they had forest fires, then they had a bit of an economic downturn, and then they had COVID-19, and then they've had the freeze of the river and the flooding in their downtown. So they've, as a community, and they're not alone, there are other communities as well that have these frequent disruptions. And if we think about our own lives, that's probably true as well. Other contexts are things like this overflow of information, this notion of really feeling fearful about what the future might hold, and having, you know, more and more, as we are inundated with images and social media posts, we think that things might be far worse than they even are. And this feeling of being overwhelmed within our work. So those are some really interesting context setting perspectives. And then Jim goes on to say, you know, we can figure out where we sit in this. Do we want to be a survivor who waits and sees what happens? Do we want to be a navigator, or do we feel like we're a victim? And so part of, you know, the context that we're thinking about as we're going through this is to say, okay, so how can we move ourselves above the line where we can kind of think about, you know, effectively navigating change. Another thing to focus on in the next slide is a paper that I wrote just, you know, as COVID was really coming upon us. I was starting to look at, you know, how the communities that Tamarack was involved with were kind of responding to COVID. And we did, for the months of March and April, we at Tamarack did a lot of publications around community response. And so we saw that, you know, there was this kind of initial response phase. And then we saw communities begin to pivot into a recover phase. And so identifying some of the kind of what is our core purpose, how do we leverage our assets and capabilities? Those are the kinds of questions that recover phase raises up for all of us. And then the resiliency phase, this kind of building resiliency, is really putting into place how we might navigate not only the pandemic that we're in right now, and some of the conversations that we're having about systemic racism and equity. How do we build our resiliency? What are the opportunities that we have to drive or to seize change and to move it forward? So that paper kind of explored these three ways that we saw communities, from the Tamarack viewpoint, that we saw communities respond to both the pandemic and some of the other rapid shifts that we've seen. The final slide in this section is really kind of something that Mark Cabage, our colleague, helped us with. So Tamarack, to give you a little bit of context, is going through a 10-year planning cycle. We've come to the end of our last strategic plan, and we're moving forward in, you know, what's the next 10 years gonna look like. But rather than say, this is exactly what the next 10 years looks like, we actually started to think about it from a social perspective. And so we see this disruption that has happened, and we see three possible futures. And this is how we are planning within, you know, these very disruptive times. So there might be a future where we return to the old equilibrium. And what would that look like? And what would how our organization respond to it? There's a possible future of finding a new equilibrium. And this might be a combination of some of the responses that happened during the pandemic, and it might also be, you know, other things that have emerged even since then. Some of the, you know, responses to the structural racism and inequality conversations that are going on. And then there's this kind of third potential future, which is really recognizing that, you know, we had this disruption, but in order to navigate our way out of the disruption, we might have some equal disruptions of other forms, right? So it might be that we'll go into a short period of economic distress, or we might have something else happen, and then how would we manage in those new disruptions? And so, you know, when we were thinking about the context, Sylvia and I, for this workshop about navigating change, we wanted to set the big picture for you and to share with you some of the things that we're considering at Tamarack and what others in the field are considering. We also wanted to ground it in Cynefin framework. And so the Cynefin framework is a great framework that we use and that lots of organizations use. And it's a way of understanding that there are different kinds of problems that communities face, and that there are different ways to kind of enter into those problems and try to figure your way out of those problems. And so there are obvious problems, or some people might refer to them as simple problems. And in the case of the obvious problem, the cause and effect is pretty straightforward. We sense the problem, we categorize it, and we respond to it, and we really lean into a best practice kind of way. There are complicated or technical problems, and in the case of a complicated or technical problem, it does require some further analysis, and it requires us bringing in people with some technical expertise and to really think about how we investigate. So again, the practice would be sense, analyze the problem, and then respond. And it's not about best practice, it's really about good practice. And an example of a technical or complicated problem might be sending a rocket to the moon, right? We need technical experts to help us figure out all the engineering that goes behind sending a rocket to the moon. And if there's a problem, those technical experts can be brought in to help us solve that. And then there's this kind of set of problems that fall into the area of complex problems. Raising a child is a really good example of a complex problem. The relationship between cause and effect can only really be perceived in hindsight. And so it's a little bit unknowable. We have kind of strategies that we would use in raising our children, but the strategies you might use for one child might vary from the strategies you would use for the second child. So again, it's about the entering into it would be about probing, sensing, and then responding. And it's always about emergent. You know, it's act, react, and adapt in some ways. And then finally, chaotic problems. And if you think of the pandemic, at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was this kind of chaotic response as, you know, people in the health sector were trying to figure out what the right practice was, the use of PPEs, the use of masks, the kind of interventions in place. And so the relationship between cause and effect is at the systems level, and we need the systems level expertise to give us some bit of a command and control, that act response. But then they start to sense the patterns that emerge once they've acted, and then they respond and shift as they go. And we've really seen that emerge, you know, over the time of the pandemic, how the chaotic problem has really come into play, and now we're moving it into the reign of, or the area of complex. And so it's interesting, right? Because even in complex problems, there are parts of it that might be obvious or simple, and other parts of it that still stay within complex. So a problem also shifts and changes over time. And so that's, I think that's helpful to think about in terms of navigating change. And so the tools that we've identified, the 3 tools that we've identified for navigating change, are tools that can be used at different times in the change cycle. And they're a way of kind of understanding that change is something that moves over time. So I'm going to ask Sylvia to take us through the eco-cycle mapping tool. So
Thanks so much, Liz. Thank you. So for me, I think, you know, all tools are helpful and useful, both in terms of getting yourself perhaps clear, but also inviting in the kind of conversations that you need to kind of host with diverse perspectives. Because what it really helps you to do is do that sense-making work that Liz was referring to as so essential in navigating change. And so think about these tools as ways of kind of neutrally inviting people into a conversation to create shared meaning about what's going on. The EcoCycle tool is a tool that we ourselves at Tamarack have used quite a bit. And one of the things that we recognize is even if we're working on issues that we anticipate will take more than a decade to resolve, it's useful to just think and plan within the context of 3 to 5 years, like setting milestones as a group and then planning within these cycles, knowing and recognizing that the cycles will repeat over time. It's helpful, this tool in particular is helpful to be able to define sort of 4 phases that long-term change efforts go through. And one of the things that's really interesting that we've learned is that as you move from one phase of maturity to the next in this kind of work, the leadership that might be needed to guide you into the next phase might need to look different. We also know, and this is a very useful tool because we've identified some very specific traps that will often limit a group from moving from the phase that they currently are in into the next. And knowing what some of those patterns are can be really illuminating for you in terms of how you would think about your own response, and also knowing the phase that's coming, what you need to consider and anticipate in terms of getting ready for that next phase. Can we go to the next slide, Duncan? So I think one of the things that was the real aha for me when I was first introduced to this tool is that first curve of the cycle, the performance loop from the birth of an idea through to its growth and maturity, is something that was really familiar to me. And so I felt really comfortable with, and it was familiar. The challenge and the benefit of the EcoCycle tool, from my perspective, is it really also invites and reminds us to think about the back loop in the cycle, or that renewal loop, and being as intentional, not just about the birth, growth, and maturity of ideas, concepts, and initiatives, but also to be really intentional about thinking about what does it mean, that everything has its time, and how do we responsibly stop doing things that at one time might have been very effective but no longer are, and recognizing that letting go of those things is not saying that those are failures, but rather an essential part of what we need to make space to create something new. So let's move into the unpacking this a little bit further. So the first, in the top left corner, the first cycle of phase of the EcoCycle is the phase of exploration. So this is a place of new ideas. People are kind of thinking big ideas, they're scoping things out. People are, from diverse perspectives, they're chiming in. There's lots of ideas, lots of options. The kind of leadership that's really beautiful in this phase is the networker. You're trying to bring in as many diverse perspectives as possible and get as many people's fingerprints on understanding what we might want to do. That's that exploration phase. Over time, as that we've been through the exploration phase for a period of time, at some point, you're going to have to look at this whole range of possible ideas for action and zero in on a handful that you think might be useful and helpful in moving you forward. Typically, I'll never forget when I was doing this work in my own community focused on community well-being, I was actually quite terrified of this choice point and zeroing in and choosing one or two options to really focus our energy and attention around. And a funder that was working with me at the time was really powerfully reminded me, if you don't choose anything, you're going to lose everybody because people want to see action happen. So you have to hedge your bets. You have to choose which of your great ideas and seedlings you're going to invest in because they show the most promise. Over time, those ideas develop and expand, and you'll see opportunities for growth and perhaps scaling out promising prototypes that you've developed in that second development phase, and you will over time see those move to maturity. So let's take a look at the maturity part of the curve. If we can go to the next slide, perfect. So The maturity phase is really about how do we maximize the efficiency. We've done our prototypes, we know what's working, so really this is about scaling. How do we get these great ideas that we have and bring them to a maturity of practice that can really help guide us forward? The leadership needed in this phase that sort of seems to resonate most is the leader as manager. You're trying to sort of keep pace with what you've now proven. And then the last phase, the release phase, is the phase that shows up when we are beginning to realize that the things that we were doing, some of them are still effective, maybe some of them are less effective than they once were. And we have to kind of step back and say, what are the things that we are going to stop doing, either because maybe other groups in the community are now doing them and we're no longer needing to do that work, or the context that we're in has changed and they're no longer as relevant or helpful as they once were. But being really intentional about things that we're going to stop, honoring them and wrapping them up is a critical phase in order to free up resources, time, and energy to imagine what new is waiting for us to explore. And then you'll see you go around the circle again. If you can go to the next slide, I think let's talk about the traps, because as I said at the start, what we know from experience is that each one of these phases, as you transition from one to the next, has some predictable traps that begin to show up that may limit you from moving effectively from that one, the phase you're in, to the phase you need to move to stay vital and vibrant. So knowing what those traps are can be really useful in helping to diagnose what may be keeping the group struck and therefore reach some agreement around what do we need to do next. So if you can go to the next slide, I will walk you through them. So the scarcity trap is the trap that shows up when you're moving from exploration to development. And typically what shows up and what you discover is you've got too few resources to support all the ideas that you've generated, and none of them seem to be taking root, and no new ideas kind of lead to the support that you're hoping for. One of the pieces that you, as you're kind of assessing what would it take to move us if we are stuck in the scarcity trap, is really thinking about maybe your membership isn't clear enough about decision-making criteria, or you can't reach alignment amongst your members in terms of where you want to focus. It may be that the members that you've engaged don't have enough credibility in the broader system to kind of mobilize the resources and support needed to advance the ideas. And or it could just be that your energy is spread too thin across too many directions and you really need to hunker down and focus. So say you've successfully navigated now from exploration to development, and you've been in the development phase for a while, you've launched a bunch of prototypes, and you're needing to sort of consider what are the experiments that you've been working with that you want to see nurtured to maturity. This is often where you get stuck in what's known as the charisma trap, where people are unable to sustain or grow the work, either without the original founder and or without the original seed funding, and they become quite parasitic on sort of the host who's incubating their initiative. What can happen is you are too dependent on existing resources, and or you are finding that your prototypes work, but they don't scale as easily and effectively as you assumed they would. So you really have to be thinking about different contexts, and also diversifying and looking for other opportunities within the existing system to help resource the work that you are experimenting with. The third trap shows up as you need to move from maturity to creative destruction. So this is where you're having to strategically step back and say, give yourself permission to maybe stop doing some things that haven't been working well. Typically, the trap that shows up here is the rigidity trap. And we call it that because people are holding on to the known and the certain that used to work before. And even in the face of evidence that says it's no longer as effective as it needs to be or should be, people have a really hard time letting go of what we are doing. There's concern about failure. There's concern about uncertainty, like what are we allowed to get out of this work? You can see self-interest show up if people have been champions of a particular initiative or not, and that can really limit you from responsibly moving to wrap up things whose time no longer is, they're no longer well suited for the time that we're in. And then the final trap shows up as you're trying to move from that creative destruction phase to launching new ideas for exploration. And what shows up often in this trap, and you'll know you're there, is because people are spinning and they're unable to reground in the core purpose and link it to the current context and what new ideas we need to move forward. So those are the traps that show up. If we can move to the next slide, how to use this as a tool. I think this framework is a really great one to just map. You can use it to map yourself. You can put an M on where you think you are in terms of your career and your development or your volunteer involvement. You can also map where you think your organization is. And if you're part of a collaborative effort, you can also simultaneously map where you think your collective impact initiative may be. And that might offer you insights into how best to move forward. So before we wrap up this explanation of a tool, I'd love to invite each one of you to do that. Take a moment and plot where you think you are on this cycle in terms of your own professional development and growth. If you're part of an organization where you see it, and or if you're part of a collaborative where you see it. Thinking about the traps, I'd also invite you to type into the chat box then some ahas that might show up for you in thinking about why you may be struggling to go to the next place, and or what you might need to help you and or your group or your organization move and stay vital and healthy.
You know something, Sylvia, someone put into the chat box strategies for navigating through one trap to the next phase. And, you know, it's really interesting to me as I, you know, have mapped myself along this and some of the collective work that I've done, that even understanding that, you know, you're spinning around and that might be an indicator that you're in an area that might be a trap. And so, you know, an example is if you go from, you know, exploration into choice, into development, to navigate through that first trap, that scarcity trap. An example might be, you know, let's just prototype something. Let's just start with one idea. So you're not making a fully developed plan, but you put a couple of seeds in the ground. And that's one way that you can actually, and say, let's watch what happens over the next 6 months. So putting a shorter time frame to it is a way of navigating your way through that trap. And
managing the risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I also have found sometimes, I know we did this in the collaborative work that I was leading in the community, and it was really, really helpful as we were thinking about moving from development to maturity. We had to go through a leadership transition. And so seeing and knowing the leader that was leading us was perfectly suited as an entrepreneur for that developmental phase. But having this framework here really helped us have a good conversation at the leadership level about the kind of leadership we really needed to move us to the phase where we had been to where we knew we needed to be. And it made us feel more confident in our choice for the leader that ultimately took over the next role. So that's one way in which we've used it. I'm seeing lots of folks kind of piping in where they are. I think it's a great way and safe way to open up a dialogue as well, right? Because different people could be in different places or have an affinity more towards one phase or another. So it can be really an opportunity to normalize and make sense of collectively what's going on within our organization or within our collaborative effort. All right. Well, thank you all for chiming in. There will be more chance to chat about this, but I don't want to lose time to look at these other two tools as well. So over to you, Liz, for this last one, the next one.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sylvia. And so the second tool that we wanted to share with you comes from the group Human Systems Dynamics, and it's called the landscape diagram. And so it really is about trying to understand where, you know, different people are on a landscape. And so the landscape diagram has 3 zones on it. It has the stable zone, which is both close to certainty and close to agreement. There's the emergent zone, which is a little bit further from certainty and a little bit further from agreement. And then there's the unstable zone. And in many ways, it kind of parallels the Cynefin framework. And so what's interesting about the landscape diagram is that you can use the diagram. You can use it either as a tool to, again, kind of figure out where you are, or you could get your group to say, okay, so where are we as individuals on the landscape and where are we as a group on the landscape? And typically how we use the landscape diagram, we use it in 2 different ways when we're facilitating conversations, you know, with colleagues at Tamarack and with our colleagues in our workshops. And so we could either give them the paper version so that they can all do it individually. And sometimes we'll actually put the landscape, draw out the landscape on the floor and have people kind of walk through the landscape and have some others observe how, you know, people are moving around the landscape. And that's a really fun way because it feels a bit more visceral for folks. And so typically we will ask 4 questions. Now, these are the questions that we use. You could use other questions, but the sense that you want to get from the questions is, how are you navigating the landscape? So the first question is, where am I right now? And it's a really interesting one. So if I were to navigate myself on this landscape or see where I am on this landscape, you know, I'm kind of in a little bit of the unstable zone, right? We've gone through COVID. We've had some changes happen at Tamarack. We've seen, you know, our members and learners respond in different kinds of ways as they've been trying to respond and adapt to Tamarack. And so, you know, we're not really sure what the future holds. We have some sense of it, but, you know, we're pretty far from certainty about the future at this point. And, you know, we have some agreement around what that might look like. So we're not at the farthest end of agreement, but, you know, at Tamarack, we've made some decisions. You know, where do I want to be in 6 months? Where is it important for me to be? My preference is to be in the emergent zone anyways. That's kind of how I like to work. But I would like to have a little bit more certainty, right? And to don't need a lot of agreement, but just kind of, you know, what's going to happen? How can we plan a little bit forward? If I look at my team I would plot in this place. So they're looking for, they're far from agreement right now, but they're looking for more agreement from us. They're looking for more direction from us. And so they have some certainty that, you know, we know we're all at Tamarack and that kind of thing, but we don't have agreement. And so that they're also in the unstable zone. And so where will they be in 6 months? Well, we think our team will sit in a place, again, in the emergent zone, and also a little bit closer to agreement. And so you can use this tool, this navigating the landscape, in a way that it really helps you kind of plot both yourself within the emerging context, but also plot where your team or your collaborative group is. And, you know, what we will often do in terms of this workshop, when we're workshopping this, is we will ask the group to say, okay, so what will it take, right? So what will it take if you think that these are the 4 points that you see yourself on the landscape diagram? What does it take for you to get from point 1 to point 2? What would it take to move your team from point 1 to point 2? It's a great kind of check-in tool. It's a great tool to kind of understand, you know, that different people on the team might be in different places and that the team as a whole might be in different places. And so the final thing that we do with the navigating the landscape diagram is that we ask people to be reflective about it. And again, you know, it's a way of both understanding that change is happening in real time, and it gives us a kind of a check-in opportunity for folks. And so again, we invite you in the chat box to maybe answer this question, right? Do you think this might be a helpful tool for you, and how could you use it, right? And so what themes might have emerged? And those are questions that we would use if we were facilitating this tool with groups. You can read more about the tool. So one of the things that we will be sending in the post email for this webinar is a fuller description of the tool and how you might use it in your context. And so that's just a quick introduction to the landscape diagram. I see that Duncan's already put it into the chat box, but we'll also send it in the post. I find it's a really kind of fun, but also very thought-provoking tool to get an understanding of where the group is and where the group might want to go in the next little while. So Sylvia, that was a quick introduction. I'm going to now turn it over to you to talk about the 3 Horizons framework.
Beautiful. I will do that. And again, I'm going to introduce it, and then I'm going to move quickly enough that we have lots of time, because I'm seeing some juicy questions show up in the chat box, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to look at those as well. So the 3 Horizons planning tool is really valuable, because what it does is it enables people to think and plan and acknowledge multiple time horizons within the context of their work. I think sometimes a lot of the conflict that shows up is that different people are focused on different horizons, and being able to depict for us all that these 3 realities are coexisting, I think can be hugely helpful as we think things through. So it's a tool that you can use certainly to build consensus on the current thinking and assumptions that we have about the current time that we're in, which is the red line. And, you know, it's very much rooted in what is our historic practice, what are the core businesses or mission elements that we are committed to affirming and testing together using Post-its. You can invite people to put things on the board. We build a shared sense of our current reality, which can be really important and helpful to build alignment across a team and to help us benefit from the diversity of perspectives that the team brings in terms of assessing our current reality. Typically with this tool, then you move, interestingly, to leaping over for Horizon 2 initially and go to Horizon 3, which is really that opportunity to imagine possible future scenarios for ourselves into the distant future. You know, given where we are now and given everything that's happening, where do we see some real opportunities for ourselves that really align with our mission and purpose that we want to be intentional about helping to nurture and foster? So you can brainstorm around that. And then when you've got some alignment there, then it's really important to go back, and this is where Horizon 2 begins to reveal itself, because what we will start to see is that there are seeds of that possible future that we're hoping for that are already starting to blossom. And so we can be really intentional about seeing those opportunities and being aligned as a group around what new opportunities we might be particularly focused on in terms of seizing. And also, you know, if you're thinking about, you know, well into the future, there may be some less desirable futures that we're trying to prevent. And so going back after we've articulated what some of those might be, we can begin to identify where some seeds are starting to be sown right now that might lay the groundwork for a less desired future, and what might we do to help navigate that as well. So I think it's a really helpful visual to build alignment, consensus, and joint sense making. So we use it to help us navigate change by thinking about our options across multiple timelines. If you can move along to the next bullet there, Duncan. So one of the things that I like is it is that opportunity for that shared sense making and building consensus. There's something too about being able to put it out on a wall and see it visually that really helps us build alignment and benefit from diverse insights and perspectives. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. I think one of the other things that I encountered that I thought was really interesting is there have been situations where, in fact, we do role-playing conversations and we assign different people in our team to be one of the time horizons, right? So typically, our current reality team tends to see Horizon 2 as too risky and Horizon 3 is just way out there and irrelevant, right? And a negative context sometimes. Horizon 2 folks tend to see Horizon 1 as obstructive and Horizon 3 as inspiring. And the visionary, which is Horizon 3, really can see that Horizon 1, because they're so focused on the future, can't believe that Horizon 1 wants to sort of stay in the present, and they see Horizon 2 as opportunities that are promising. So helpful to have those conversations, because then we can also, we all have tendencies to sort of align more with one of these 3 time horizons typically. And so it gives us a fun way to kind of surface what some of those tensions might look like and explore conversations around if this was going to be done in a positive and supportive way, how might we get these 3 to work well together? Okay, on to the next slide. I think we're ready for some questions, Liz.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we were going to just talk about briefly before we dive into the questions are just some of the lessons that we've learned, Sylvia, in implementing, you know, any one of these approaches, whether it's the Cynefin framework or, you know, the 3 horizons or the eco cycle or even the landscape diagram. And the lesson for me is to, you know, be very thoughtful about what it is you're entering into, right? And so, you know, what kind of change are you navigating right now? That's where the Cynefin framework can be really helpful in terms of that sensing or making sense of the type of problem, you know, you're entering into. And then if you think about, you know, I really want to move a group, you might use the landscape diagram or you might use the eco cycle. If you really want to move your planning forward, you might use the 3 horizons tool. So those are, you know, some of the ways that I might think about it. What about you, Sylvia? How might you go about it?
I think for me, what I would want to do is really be mindful about how do we create the kind of safe space and a neutral enough conversation that we can be honoring of the wisdom of diverse perspectives. And I think what I value in these is how to bring them in to normalize the diversity of perspectives and to avoid polarizing and build appreciation for that rich. If we can stand still long enough to create a shared picture, we are much stronger in terms of being able to assess what options and opportunities are there for us. So I think that these tools generally are really good ways to anchor and validate diverse perspectives and then build alignment and at least understanding around a joint way to move forward, because they invite us to pause. And I think that's the most valuable thing, paradoxically, when we're feeling so panicked because change, it feels like it's upon us and we need to come up with the answer. I think that's probably one of the most important lessons for me around this.
Great. So Duncan, why don't you lead us into some questions?
Yeah, thank you both for all your insight on those tools. And thank you everyone that has submitted questions or comments so far. If you haven't yet, feel free to open up the Q&A panel. Even if you don't have a question, you can use the thumbs up feature to vote on which questions you'd like to see answered. The first question comes from Stephanie, and they ask, how does panarchy play into the wider view of resiliency?
So some people would refer to the eco cycle as a panarchy cycle or an adaptive cycle. And so I think that, you know, my understanding of panarchy is that with the eco cycle, it's not often just one thing, right? It's not just that we're, one space on the ecocycle. We're actually, we might be in multiple spaces, and the work that we're doing would also be in multiple spaces. And so we can have nested ecocycles within that one ecocycle, and it really helps us kind of navigate the panarchy, or it helps us kind of understand a bit more deeply the panarchy cycle.
And for me, I think the only other thing I would add is we often talk a lot about systems change, right? So there's things that organizations can do individually and or that communities can do individually to navigate a change process. But what we know is that change becomes much stronger and more sustainable when we're having similar changes sort of occurring in alignment at different levels throughout the system. And I think what's helpful for me about this is to not just look. Your reminder about panarchy for me is thinking about where are there opportunities to move what we are doing beyond our own individual organization or collective and actually align with others to create a bigger movement in, a provincial system or in a national system, for example, as well as us doing that work that we're doing on the ground.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Our next question comes from Chris, and they ask, mapping may be helpful, but less so unless we can have some possible interventions for traps in our pocket. What are some suggestions you have for how to learn about solutions to these traps?
I think that's a really great question, and I think it's very context specific, and so it's looking at what are the elements that really created that trap for that initiative, right? Or for you as an individual. And so I'd want to think about, what's the context in which this, we've entered into this trap. Is it that, if you think about the scarcity trap, for example, in the eco cycle, is it that the ideas were that we had too many ideas and that nobody was compelled enough to pick one of the ideas? And so it's really kind of looking at specifically what happened that brought us into the scarcity trap, and then what's the strategy that we might use or that we might deploy to kind of move out of that trap. And I think the table that Sylvia put into the slide is helpful because there are some hints in the table, but it's also kind of thinking about, do we prototype? Do we take some of the ideas from the social innovation field? Do we, look back at that and have a conversation about it, right? So we can say, hey, it looks like none of these ideas are compelling enough for us. What would make one of these ideas compelling enough for us to want to prototype it, right? And, if you think about moving from scarcity into what I would call the parasitic trap, and Sylvia called the charismatic trap, that's where, one thing becomes a parasite on the other. It's really kind of thinking about, okay, so, what is happening is one group making decisions too slowly for the other group to move forward, and then having a conversation about that. And so for me, when I use the eco cycle, I really look at each of the traps individually and start to plan strategies based on what the context is telling us to move through that trap. But I think it's interesting to think about, could we, have a subset of kind of strategies that you might be able to say, well, would this help us diagnose?
And for me, I think the other way I've used the eco cycle is as a forward planning tool. So not waiting until we're stuck in one trap or another. But I think about, for example, some of the work that the group in Kahnawake has been doing around creating a community-wide initiative around collective impact. And they knew that, they needed to build consensus and support across the whole community, but given the bandwidth of the volunteers and the support staff, they could only really choose a small number of initiatives to really champion at the get-go if they were going to get traction in the community. And so one of the things that they did, knowing the scarcity trap, knowing that, they needed to go with ideas that had a lot of passion and energy from and endorsement from the community behind them, was they actually developed 6 possible ideas just loosely, and then had an open house in the community where they invited the community to indicate where did the community believe that there was the most interest and urgency to kind of champion these ideas, saying that they were all important, recognizing they were all interconnected. Where do we put our energy first? And I think that that was a really useful way, like looking at that scarcity trap, knowing the concern about not having enough passion around the ideas, really enabled them to think about how do we keep that momentum going and how do we create that as a moment to just test that there is passion and interest in the community and use that as our guide in terms of narrowing our scope and giving us a starting point. And I think that was really helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I think we have time for one more question, and it's a question that came up a few times in chat. What advice would you have for organizations that are in the release part of the eco cycle but actually fail to let go?
Such a good question. I think that we are notoriously bad at letting things go, right? That we just tend to layer and layer and layer in most organizations, and we have a very difficult time letting things go. And so I think it is, again, it's having that conversation, right? What, if we're going to go back into kind of the ideation phase or the exploration phase, what do we need to let go right now to create the space for new ideas to emerge? And I think, it's interesting because these things are connected, right? It's this eco cycle, but they're connected, because if we don't successfully let things go, we actually limit the new ideas from emerging, right? And so I think that those things are connected to one another. And if we don't make a choice around those ideas, we actually will end up developing too many things, right? And so it's the eco cycle is a really interesting way of kind of thinking about how change happens and how we navigate change, and how we can really create that green space. It comes from the reason why it's called the eco cycle is that, it likens itself to, how ecology happens, right? We need to have a garden die off so that we can create the space to plant the new seeds, right? And we need the new seeds to grow and develop, and then they go through that kind of performance curve and then go back into dormancy. And I think that in our sector, in a lot of the community sector work, we're notoriously bad at the letting go. So it is really paying attention to that piece. I think also, Sylvia, the one thing, sorry, I'm going to jump in because I know you wanted to say something. The one thing that I was thinking about when you responded in your last response, there are people who have an orientation to a certain part of the eco cycle as well. I know I love the idea phase and the early development phase, but once you kind of move up the performance curve, I get a little bored, right? And I'm not very good at letting go. But there are people that love moving people up the performance curve. There are other people that are very good at letting things go. So we all have a preference. And I think, what's interesting is to know on your team who has which preferences or which tendencies, and could we invite them to lead that phase? And would that help us kind of move from one place to the next place on the eco cycle?
I think that's a beautiful reminder, Liz, because it made me think one of the most powerful people I encountered was a gray nun who had been through a dialogue where they knew their order was dying, right? They knew there were no more gray nuns coming. Their average age was in their 70s. And she was the truth teller. She was the one who named for her order, this is what's happening for us. And she said, I would like to be the one, right, to guide us through a very intentional process of letting go. And that actually was profoundly healing. And she had tremendous courage because I think, as you said, lots of people, myself included, would shy away from that creative destruction phase. But it does also make me think about, is that an opportunity from an organizational context to maybe look beyond your own organization? And what are the network of organizations that do exist in the community? Because some of that stuckness or fear may come from what will happen. You know, how will these needs of the community get met if we take ourselves out of this work? And I think being really intentional about handing off to others in the community the elements of that work that still need to continue with a sense of responsibility, I think can go a long way to also helping navigate that process.
One final thought, Duncan, I see you're coming back on the screen. I think we will be letting go of more things as we go into the next phase post-pandemic, right? There are some organizations that won't be coming back that provided vital services in our communities. And so I think we'll be forced into some of that creative destruction, and it will actually force us to kind of think about, so what next for us? And so, you know, the post-pandemic phase is going to have us build our muscle in that area for sure.
Yeah, thank you both for that answer. I think those are both very thoughtful perspectives on that. And I suspect that's probably the hardest part of the cycle, at least for me personally. So thank you for that. We are unfortunately at time today, but I have a few quick announcements before we go. The first is that the Tamarack Institute is committed to producing free community building webinars each week through the fall now. So after the webinar today, we're going to be sending you an email with a couple opportunities over the next few weeks. Some really exciting webinars coming up, including one on youth engagement. So yeah, definitely remember to look out for that. And lastly, Tamarack Institute has recently launched a new online course called The Foundations of Community Engagement. I've just put a link to the course in chat. But it's a self-directed course that guides you through pre-recorded videos, case studies, tools to help equip you for community change. So if you're curious about that, I definitely encourage you to check out our new course. Just wanted to thank you again for joining us today, and to thank Liz and Sylvia for sharing your wisdom with us. We really appreciate you spending this part of the day with us, and we hope to see you soon.